A paralyzed billionaire, a penniless maid, and a conspiracy so deep it has already killed 3 people and is about to kill more. Here is everything you need to know. Ethan Hawthorne was 31 years old when he built one of the most valuable technology companies in American history from a converted warehouse with 11 employees and nothing but conviction. By 34, he was worth tens of billions of dollars, engaged to the woman he loved, and preparing to take his company public in what financial analysts were calling the deal of the decade. Then one rainy night, his car went off a private mountain road. The police called it an accident, brake failure, wet conditions, tragic and nobody's fault. It was nobody's accident. His cousin Ryan Hawthorne, the one family member who had been there from the beginning, who had sat in that converted warehouse in the early days and called himself a believer, had spent 11 minutes alone with Ethan's car that afternoon. 11 minutes was all it took. And when Ethan survived the crash but lost the use of his body, Ryan stepped smoothly into the executive chairman's seat and began doing what he had always intended to do: dismantle everything Ethan built and transfer it, piece by piece, into his own hands. But Ryan had a problem. Ethan was still alive, still legally the majority shareholder, still technically capable of signing documents that could reverse everything Ryan had constructed, which meant Ryan needed Ethan alive, cooperative, and most importantly, manageable. So he brought in a private clinic with no registered address and a nurse named Linda who administered every single morning, a compound that didn't exist in any legitimate pharmaceutical database. Not a sedative, not a painkiller. A cognitive compliance drug, designed to keep a man present enough to sign his name and too medicated to remember having done it. For 3 years it almost worked. Then an exhausted young maid named Grace Carter fell asleep, holding Ethan's hand. Grace was 24 years old, a former nursing student who had abandoned her education to pay for her mother's kidney dialysis, working in the Hawthorne Mansion to keep her family alive. She wasn't trying to reach him. She wasn't performing kindness. She simply ran out of energy in the chair beside his bed, and her hand found his the way a trained nurse's hand always finds a patient, automatically, instinctively, asking for nothing. Ethan opened his eyes and saw her. And something the medication had buried for 3 years broke open in his chest. He smiled. One real, unguarded, unmedicated smile. And it triggered a chain of events that Ryan Hawthorne had spent 3 years and $2 billion making sure could never happen. Because Grace noticed things: the unlabeled syringe, the pharmaceutical document with no diagnosis and a drug name that appeared in no legitimate database, the private clinic with no address, the nurse whose fear was specific and personal. And when Grace went home and opened a folder she had carried for 5 years without fully reading, her dead father's employment records, she found a badge that changed everything. Daniel Carter, Senior Security Consultant, Hawthorne Technologies. Her father had worked for the same company, died on the same road, in an accident described in identical language, wet conditions, brake failure, exactly 1 month before Ethan's crash. He was one of 3 employees with access to the company's most sensitive financial records who died in suspicious accidents within 18 months of each other. Same road, same language, same investigating officer, who retired 6 months after Ethan's crash on a pension 3 times the government standard. Grace had not stumbled into Hawthorne Mansion. She had been placed there by a woman named Sophia Vane, a forensic accountant who was supposed to be the 3rd victim, who faked her own death instead, who had spent 3 years building a complete financial dossier on Ryan's fraud from a quiet apartment 40 minutes away, and who had engineered Grace's arrival as the one move Ryan would never see coming. Meanwhile, Martin Doyle, the family attorney who had watched the tampered break footage and said nothing for 3 years, finally chose his conscience. He filed an emergency injunction. He prepared formal testimony. He delivered everything to a federal investigator. And Ryan, watching the smile footage on his monitor at 4 in the morning, moved his deadline forward and began making the calls that would either save his empire or destroy it entirely. The clock is running. The walls are closing in. And the questions driving every scene of Part 3 are these. How many more people did Ryan kill to build this empire? And how much deeper does the conspiracy go? Can Ethan reclaim his company, his freedom, and his body before Ryan executes the final transfer that makes everything irreversible? What will Ryan do when he realizes the person he most underestimated was not Grace, but the dead woman who sent her? And when the truth about Richard Hawthorne's death surfaces, the truth that makes this not a 3-year fraud but a 5-year murder conspiracy, who in that mansion will survive what comes next? Stay with me. Because Part 3 is not about whether justice arrives. It is about the price every person pays before it does. The city was still dark when Ryan Hawthorne moved the deadline forward. It was 4:47 in the morning, and the Hawthorne Mansion breathed around him with the specific quiet of a house that was never truly empty. The hum of climate systems cycling through their night settings, the occasional measured footfall of the security rotation making its rounds along the ground floor perimeter, the distant sound of the fountain in the front courtyard that ran continuously because Ryan had decided 3 years ago that stopping it would alter the property's visual consistency, and visual consistency was something he considered worth the electricity cost. He had made that decision the same week he moved into the master suite on the 3rd floor, Ethan's suite, which Ryan had begun using within 6 weeks of the accident, telling the household staff that proximity to the building's primary security hub made it a practical choice. Nobody had questioned it. Nobody questioned most things Ryan said, which was something he had cultivated with the same precision he applied to everything else in his life. The practiced, pleasant authority of a man who had learned, early and thoroughly, that the difference between confidence and dominance was simply a matter of consistency. He sat now at his private study desk with 3 monitors active and a legal pad in front of him that he had filled on one side with numbers and on the other almost unconsciously, with a shape he only noticed when he looked down directly. The outline of a watch face, traced in pen during the moments between calls when his hand had nothing else to do. Cracked glass. Frozen hands. He covered it with his palm and returned his attention to the rightmost monitor, where a courthouse filing activity tracker had flagged, at 4:31, an emergency injunction application submitted through the office of Martin Doyle, attorney at law. Ryan had read the flag 3 times before making the first call. He was on his 11th call now, and the deadline he had set for the final share transfer, which would permanently reduce Ethan's controlling interest to a minority stake and make Ryan's executive authority structural rather than delegated, unreachable by any subsequent medical recovery or legal challenge, had moved from 48 hours to 36. Judge Arthur Penfield answered on the second ring. He was 63 years old and had served on the circuit court for 19 years, and his voice in the pre-dawn dark carried the careful blankness of a man who had learned to sound neither awake nor asleep when calls came at hours that required deniability. He had been on the Hawthorne family payroll for 11 of those 19 years, a relationship that had begun, as these arrangements always begin, with a single small favor that had seemed, at the time, like the kind of thing a reasonable man might do for a family of significant community standing, and had grown, through the accumulation of subsequent favors, into something that required him to answer calls at 4:52 in the morning and discuss the administrative fate of legal filings in a voice carefully drained of all inflection. "I've seen it," Penfield said. "It comes to your docket," Ryan replied. "It does. I need it to disappear before it enters the public record." The pause that followed was not the pause of a man deciding. It was the pause of a man calculating, the specific arithmetic of a person who had been performing this calculation for 11 years, and had developed a fluency in it that disgusted him only in the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, when the bourbon had worn off, and the court seal on his wall caught the light from the hallway. "The clerk who processes morning filings," Penfield said, "occasionally makes administrative errors during the intake process." "I imagine he does. Give me until 8 o'clock. Ryan ended the call and added a notation to his legal pad. He thought about Martin Doyle as he wrote, about the specific quality of Martin's deterioration over the past 3 years, the dark circles and the damp collar, and the way his hands had developed a tremor that he disguised through constant occupation. Ryan had watched Martin approaching his limit for 18 months and had decided, with the analytical detachment of a man who processed human beings the way other people processed financial instruments, that Martin would hold. That the fear Ryan had installed in him the morning after the accident, in a hospital waiting room, with Ethan still in surgery, with 6 words delivered in a murmur so quiet they left no trace, would continue to outweigh whatever conscience Martin was carrying. He had miscalculated. It was a rare experience, and he sat with it for a moment, giving it the honest attention he believed mistakes deserved. Martin had filed, which meant Martin had found something or someone that had tipped the balance, which meant the variable was not Martin's conscience, which Ryan had correctly assessed as insufficient on its own. The variable was Grace Carter, who had placed a letter under Martin's office door and had correctly identified, in a man she had never met, the precise nature of what was eating him alive. Ryan had underestimated her twice. He would not do it a third time. He switched to the surveillance feed and studied the East Wing corridor, the mahogany double doors, the 4-inch gap that was open again despite Crane's instruction to close it, the angle of the camera that caught the gap at exactly wheelchair height. He had been telling himself for a week that the gap was carelessness. He understood now, with the clarity that arrives when self-deception becomes too expensive to maintain, that the gap was architecture. Deliberate, patient, and communicating something to someone Ryan had not yet fully identified. Ethan was not as gone as Ryan had needed him to be. The thought arrived without drama and sat in his chest with a specific weight, not fear, not yet, but the precursor to it. The weight of a man who has built something very tall on a foundation he is beginning to suspect is not as solid as he measured. He needed 36 hours. He picked up the phone for the 12th call. 3 floors above, in the room with the 4-inch gap, Ethan Hawthorne sat facing the pre-dawn window and counted Ryan's calls by the vibration he could detect through the building's infrastructure when the private study's secure line activated. A sensitivity he had developed through 3 years of converting his enforced stillness into something approaching a sixth sense for the building's rhythms. He had been doing this since the medication's morning window opened at 3, when the previous day's compound had metabolized sufficiently to allow clarity. 11 calls. He had heard Ryan make 11 calls before 5 in the morning on only 2 previous occasions, once when a board member had threatened to request an independent audit, and once when a journalist had begun asking questions about the offshore structure. Both situations had resolved, for Ryan, within 48 hours, in ways that the people involved had found quietly devastating. Ethan was not a board member or a journalist, but he was something Ryan had never faced before, a man with nothing physical left to lose and 3 years of perfect, medicated silence to draw on, during which he had built, inside the vault of his own mind, a case so complete and so specific that it would require only the right person to carry it to the right authority to dismantle everything Ryan had constructed. He had found that person. She was 24 years old, and she had fallen asleep holding his hand without knowing he was awake. He let the ghost of a smile cross his face in the dark, where no camera angle could record it. The clock was running. So, for the first time in 3 years, was he. Nurse Linda Marsh had been lying to herself for 2 years, 8 months, and 14 days. She knew the precise count because she had started it the morning after she first administered the compound. The day she had stood in her bathroom before her shift and looked at her own reflection with the specific, searching attention of a person who needs to determine whether the face looking back is still recognizable as someone they had once intended to be. She had been a nurse for 19 years. She had spent those years in ICUs and cancer wards and emergency departments, in the specific, sustained intimacy of caring for people at their most diminished, and she had built her professional identity on a principle so fundamental she had never needed to articulate it. First, do no harm. She had articulated it to herself every morning since. Like a woman repeating a prayer she no longer believed in but could not stop saying. She was 51 years old and she had a daughter named Claire who was 19 and studying environmental science at a state university, and who called her mother every Sunday and talked about soil composition and water tables with an enthusiasm that Linda found, on the Sunday calls, genuinely restorative. The weekly reminder that something she had made was entirely clean, entirely unmarked by the compromises that had accumulated around the rest of her life like sediment. Ryan had approached her through the private clinic 2 years and 9 months ago. The offer had been framed, initially, as specialized private nursing, an affluent family, a paralyzed patient with complex needs, discretion required, compensation reflecting the sensitivity of the role. The compensation had been 3 times her hospital's salary. She had a daughter starting university in 4 months, and a mortgage that her hospital salary covered with nothing remaining for anything else. And she had told herself, accepting the first payment, that she was simply providing care in a private setting. The first time she administered the compound, she had not known what it was. The second time, she had suspected. The third time, she had known, because she had taken a photograph of the drug vial's partial label on her personal phone and sent it to a retired pharmacologist she had trained under 15 years earlier, and he had called her back within an hour in a voice that contained the specific, controlled alarm of a man who had spent his career trying to prevent exactly this kind of use. She had continued administering it for 2 years and 8 months after knowing. She had told herself it was because of Claire, because of the mortgage, because Ryan had made it clear, in the pleasant, indirect way he made everything clear, that the terms of her employment included a non-disclosure component that she should consider carefully before deciding to discuss her work with anyone. He had smiled when he said it. He always smiled. But the smile had contained, in its specific quality, the same information a locked door contains, not an invitation, but a boundary, and a clear indication of what lay on the other side of crossing it. She had understood. She had stayed. And then Grace Carter had arrived, 24 years old and observant in the way that nursing students were observant, with eyes that moved over a room the way a trained clinician's eyes moved, registering and filing and connecting, quietly and continuously, without appearing to do so. Linda had spotted it on Grace's first day and had recognized it immediately because she had once had those eyes herself. Had looked at the world with exactly that quality of attention before the compromises began accumulating. Grace had read the pharmaceutical document. Linda had watched her lips move. And something had shifted, in Linda's chest, with the specific quality of a thing that has been under sustained pressure for a very long time, finally finding its fracture point. She had not slept the night Grace was reassigned to the laundry wing. She had spent those hours sitting at her kitchen table writing a statement that she completed, deleted, rewrote, and deleted again 4 times before finally, at 5 in the morning, printing it without rereading because she understood that rereading was the mechanism by which her fear would reassert itself, and she was finished. She had decided. With letting her fear make her decisions. The statement was 4 pages. It described everything: the compound, the clinic, the dosage escalations that corresponded with legal activity, Ryan's specific instructions, and the date on which she had first understood that she was not providing medical care but performing pharmaceutical imprisonment on a man who could not refuse her. She had sent one copy to the independent physician the court had appointed through Martin's injunction filing. She had kept the original, and she had driven to the physician's office at 7:15 in the morning before her shift to confirm receipt, because something in her, the same clinical instinct that had once made her an exceptional nurse, told her that confirmation was necessary, that leaving things to process without verification was no longer something she could afford. The office had been broken into overnight. Not ransacked, not obviously disturbed, but broken into in the careful, professional way that someone breaks into a space when they know exactly what they are looking for and want to leave no impression of having been there at all. Filing cabinet drawers returned to their original positions, but not quite flush. A desk chair repositioned 3 inches from its habitual location, betrayed by the worn patch of carpet that marked where it always sat. The computer terminal screen slightly angled from its calibrated position. Nothing taken, but the copy of Linda's statement, which the physician's assistant had confirmed receiving via email at 11:40 the previous night, was no longer in the filing system it had been logged into. Linda stood in the center of the office and felt the specific cold clarity of a person who has finally, irreversibly, understood the dimensions of what they are dealing with. She drove to her car. She sat in the driver's seat. She opened the glove compartment for her parking validation and found, sitting on top of it, a sealed envelope with her name on it in handwriting she did not recognize. Inside, a single photograph and one sentence typed on unmarked paper. The photograph was of Claire, walking between university buildings, backpack over one shoulder, laughing at something outside the frame. Taken recently, she was wearing the jacket she had bought 3 weeks ago, which Linda had seen on their last video call and commented on. The sentence read, "Careful women raise careful daughters. We'd hate for carelessness to become a family trait." Linda sat with the photograph in her hands for 40 seconds. Then she dialed Ryan's number. He answered on the first ring. "I received something this morning," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. She had decided in those 40 seconds what she was going to do, and the decision had produced in her a quality of calm that she recognized, from her years in emergency medicine, as the specific composure of a person who has moved past fear into something colder and more functional on the other side of it. "I imagine you did," Ryan said. "I hope it was clarifying." "It was," Linda said. "Thank you." She ended the call. Then she opened a second application on her phone, a simple audio recording app that she had been running continuously since the morning of Grace's reassignment, activated through a habit formed 8 months ago when she had begun to understand that the only thing standing between her and Ryan's version of events, if this ever unraveled, was documentation she controlled independently. 8 months of recordings. Every conversation Ryan had conducted in Ethan's corridor, every instruction he had given through her, every reference to the compound, the clinic, the dosage schedule, and the signature requirements that had accumulated into a case file far more complete than the 4-page statement that had been removed from the physician's office. She saved the morning's call. Then she composed a message to a number she had found, through 3 weeks of careful research, attached to a federal pharmaceutical crimes division investigator who had published a paper 18 months ago on cognitive compliance compounds that Linda had read with the recognition of someone reading an accurate description of a thing she had seen with her own eyes. She attached the 8 months of recordings. She pressed send. Then she drove to the mansion, walked through the staff entrance, changed into her uniform, and administered Ethan's morning injection at the scheduled time, because maintaining her routine was, for the next 36 hours, the most important thing she could do. But this morning, for the first time in 2 years, 8 months and 14 days, the compound in the syringe was not what Ryan had prescribed. Linda had made the substitution at home before leaving. Ethan Hawthorne's morning injection contained saline. Grace had not intended to stay awake all night. She had arrived home at 9:15, made tea she didn't drink, kissed her mother's forehead and pulled Noah's blanket up to his chin with the automatic, practiced tenderness of someone who had been doing it for so long it had become a form of breathing, necessary, unconscious, the thing her body did without consulting her mind. She had sat at the small kitchen table, and she had opened the folder. By 4 in the morning, the folder was surrounded by 3 notebooks, 2 printed pages from the public business registry she had accessed on her phone, and a map she had drawn by hand on the back of one of Noah's school worksheets. The mountain road, marked with 3 points, each annotated with a date and a name. Daniel Carter, 42, senior security consultant, died 3 years and 2 months ago. Marcus Webb, 37, senior software engineer, died 4 years and 1 month ago. Patricia Adami, 44, forensic accountant, financial compliance division, died 4 years and 3 months ago. 3 people, 3 accidents on private or semi-private roads, all within a 40-minute radius of the Hawthorne estate. All 3 employed by Hawthorne Technologies in divisions with access to the company's internal financial architecture. All 3 accidents investigated, initially, by the same highway patrol officer, a Sergeant Dale Forsyth, who had filed the incident reports with thoroughness and promptness, who had been commended by his department for his work on the Adami case specifically, and who had retired 6 months after Ethan's own crash at age 49 on a pension that the state retirement schedule, which Grace had also located through the public registry, indicated would have required another 11 years of service to justify. She had built this map from public records, from her father's file, from the newspaper clippings she had found behind his badge, and from 2 hours of cross-referencing through a public library database she had accessed on her phone with the focused, methodical intensity of someone who had once studied for nursing finals by building connections between systems that didn't appear on the surface to be related. 3 deaths, same employer, same financial clearance level, same road system, same investigating officer. It was not a coincidence, it was a pattern. And patterns, her father had once told her, sitting at this same table in this same kitchen, when she was 12 years old, and had noticed that the bus on their street ran late by the same number of minutes every Tuesday, which he had explained was because the Tuesday driver had a standing coffee stop. Patterns were the universe's way of leaving a signature on things it wanted found. She had written Patricia Adami's name 3 times in her notebook, circling it each time, because something about the forensic accountant nagged at her in a way the others didn't. Her father had been security. Marcus Webb had been engineering. These were roles that might have encountered financial irregularities incidentally in the course of other work. But a forensic accountant in the financial compliance division was not someone who encountered financial records incidentally. That was someone whose entire professional function was to find exactly what Grace suspected Ryan had been hiding. She went back to the business registry. Patricia Adami's death record had been filed in the county adjacent to the one Grace had searched initially, a detail that had required her to search twice, which suggested either administrative inconsistency or a deliberate filing in the less obvious jurisdiction. The death certificate listed a highway collision as cause, and the certifying physician's name as the attending medical examiner. Grace cross-referenced the medical examiner. He had retired 18 months after filing the certificate, at 54. And his retirement announcement in a local professional newsletter had mentioned a private consulting practice he was establishing, with an address in the same private medical complex that housed the clinic whose name had appeared on the pharmaceutical document in Ethan's room. She sat back in her chair and looked at the map she had drawn on Noah's school worksheet. The web was larger than she had understood 2 days ago. It had more anchoring points, more participants, more structure than a man acting alone could have constructed and maintained. This was not Ryan and a nurse and a clinic. This was a network, carefully assembled over years, with redundancies built in, with each participant knowing only enough to perform their function and not enough to see the whole. Her father had seen the whole. That was why he had died. She was still sitting with this when her phone buzzed at 5:40 with a message from an unknown number. 8 digits, no carrier identification, the format of a burner device. You found the map. Your father found it first. There is a 4th name that isn't on any public record. Come to 14 Alderton Close before noon. Come alone. Tell no one. SV. Grace stared at the message for a long time. SV. She had not yet told anyone about Sophia Vane. She had discovered the name only through the financial registry cross-referencing she had done in the past 4 hours, tracking the corporate ghost of a forensic accountant whose death record contained one anomaly she hadn't mentioned in her notes yet. The emergency contact listed was not a family member, as was standard, but a legal firm that Grace had traced to a post office box that had been opened 3 months before Patricia Adami's reported death and closed 6 months after. Nobody opened a legal firm post office box 3 months before their death, unless they were planning for a future they expected to be conducting under a different name. Patricia Adami had not died. She had disappeared. And she had just sent Grace a message at 5:40 in the morning, which meant she had been watching closely enough to know what Grace had found, and when she had found it, which meant the apartment at 14 Alderton Close was not a destination Grace had been invited to. It was a destination she had always been moving toward. She folded the map, placed it in her bag alongside her father's badge and the newspaper clipping, and went to wake her mother early enough to explain that she had an errand before her shift, framing it, as she framed everything, in language calibrated to protect Emily from the weight of what Grace was actually carrying. "I'm meeting someone about a nursing school opportunity," she said. Emily looked at her daughter for a long moment with the specific attention of a woman who had raised a child alone and knew, with the precision that love and proximity produce, when that child was not telling her everything. "Grace," she said quietly. "I'll be careful, Mum." Emily reached out and took her daughter's hand. "Your father used to say that too," she said, "right before he wasn't." Grace held her mother's hand for a moment without speaking. Then she picked up her bag and walked out into the early morning, carrying her father's map and a dead woman's address, moving towards something she could not yet fully see but could feel, the way you feel, in a very dark room, the specific quality of an open door. Charles Whitfield had worked in service for 41 years. He had begun at 19 as a junior footman in a house so old its plumbing still remembered the Victorian era, had risen through a series of increasingly prominent households, each one larger, each one more generously appointed, each one carrying beneath its polished surfaces the specific varieties of human dysfunction that great wealth tends to cultivate rather than resolve, and had arrived at the Hawthorne family 31 years ago, not 20 as the official employment record showed. Because the 11 years before the record were not years, the current management of the household had any knowledge of. He had come to the Hawthornes during Richard Hawthorne's tenure as patriarch, had been hired personally by Richard in the way that Richard did everything, which was to say directly, without intermediary, after a 40-minute conversation that had felt less like a job interview than like two people determining whether they could trust each other. Charles had concluded at the end of that conversation that Richard Hawthorne was the most honest rich man he had ever encountered. Honest in the specific, unglamorous way that was entirely distinct from moral performance. Honest because he believed truth was a more efficient operating principle than its alternatives, and because he had spent enough time around people who operated differently to have observed the comparative outcomes clearly. He had served Richard for 22 years. He had been in the house the night Richard died. He carried this fact the way he carried everything significant, quietly, without external indication, in the specific interior manner of a man who had learned, across 4 decades of service, that what you held inside was always safer than what you put down where others could examine it. He had not told anyone what he heard that night. Not because he was afraid precisely, though fear was part of it, but because he had sat with the question, who would believe the word of a butler over the conclusions of a death certificate, over the assembled authority of a medical examiner and a family attorney, and a grieving nephew who had stepped forward with such apparent devotion to manage the family's affairs, and had found no satisfying answer. He had instead developed the habit of watching. He had watched Ryan for 5 years with the focused, unobtrusive attention of a man who understood that his invisibility in a household was a form of power that the household's principals consistently underestimated. Butlers, in his experience, occupied a paradox. The more essential they were to the functioning of a household, the less the household's principals registered their presence as a conscious individual entity. He moved through the mansion like furniture seen, relied upon, and never truly noticed. He had noticed everything, including, 3 years ago, a piece of paper he had found on Ethan's study desk at 6:45 in the morning after the accident, when he had gone to close the study windows before the cleaning crew arrived. The room had been sealed by 9 o'clock, once word came from the hospital about the extent of the injuries. But in the 45 minutes between 6:45 and the sealing, Charles had been in that room, closing windows, and the note had been on the desk in plain view, written in Ethan's precise, compressed handwriting on a piece of the company's headed notepaper. He had read it without touching it. He had memorized it, because the training of his particular kind of professional life had made memorization a reflex. Menus, schedules, preferences, the specific requirements of people who had never learned to remember things for themselves, because they had always had someone to remember for them. The note read, "To whoever finds this first, if something happens to me tonight, look at the offshore accounts held under the name Heron Capital. R has been moving money through it for 2 years. I have dates and amounts. They are stored in the blue ledger, second drawer of the desk under the false bottom. If I'm wrong about tonight and you're reading this as a curiosity, disregard. But if I'm right, don't trust anyone with a Hawthorne name." Charles had stood in front of that note for 11 seconds. Then he had gone to the second drawer of the desk. It was empty. The false bottom had been opened recently. He could see the faint disturbance in the drawer's lining, the pressed velvet slightly displaced from its corners. Whatever had been there was gone, removed before Charles arrived, which meant removed in the hours between Ethan's departure and the accident's occurrence, which meant removed by someone who had known to look. He had never found the right moment to tell anyone about the note. He had told himself for 3 years that the right moment would come. He was 60 years old now, and his knees had developed the kind of persistent ache that reminded him daily that the right moment did not have an infinite runway. He had watched Grace Carter move through this house for 3 weeks with those careful, nursing school eyes, and he had recognized in her something he had recognized only twice before in 41 years of service. A person who was genuinely, constitutionally incapable of walking past a thing that needed addressing. He found her in the East Wing corridor at 7:30, before her laundry shift began. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. She turned. "Walk with me to the linen room," he said. "I need to show you something." They walked without speaking. He closed the linen room door behind them and stood with his hands clasped in front of him. the habitual posture of a man managing the space between professional composure and personal urgency. "I have been carrying something for 3 years," he said. "I want you to understand that I did not know when I decided to carry it how heavy it would become." Grace waited. He recited the note from memory, word for word, with the precision of a man who had repeated it to himself every day for 3 years to ensure he did not lose a single syllable. Grace was very still when he finished. "Heron Capital," she said. "Yes. That name is in the financial dossier I was given this morning." Charles looked at her carefully. "By whom?" "Someone who faked her own death to keep building a case against Ryan." She paused. "She registered Heron Capital, or rather, she documented that it was registered in the maiden name of Ryan's mother, a woman who died 20 years ago." Charles was quiet for a moment. "Ryan's mother," he said slowly, "died in this house. I was here. She was 43 years old, and the official cause was cardiac arrhythmia, and Richard Hawthorne, who was alive then, who had been a widower himself for 6 years at that point, was devastated by it. He told me once that he had loved his sister-in-law like a member of his own family." He paused. "Ryan was 14. He found her." Grace looked at him. "Ryan was 14 when his mother died," she said quietly, "and he used her name for his fraud operation." "Yes." They stood in the linen rooms, white quiet for a moment, with the weight of that. "There's more," Charles said. "The night Richard Hawthorne died, I was in the house. I heard the argument." And then, for the first time in 5 years, Charles Whitfield told someone what he had heard. The apartment at 14 Alderton Close was the kind of place that announced, through every deliberate detail of its exterior presentation, that it did not wish to be noticed. The building itself was indistinguishable from the 6 identical structures flanking it on both sides, mid-century construction, maintained to the minimum threshold of respectability, the kind of building that appeared in the background of other people's photographs and was never the subject of them. The mailboxes in the lobby were unmarked. The lift was out of order in a way that seemed less like mechanical failure and more like a considered decision. The corridor on the 4th floor smelled of institutional carpet cleaner, and the specific quietness of a space that its inhabitants treated as a place to disappear into rather than to live in. Grace had knocked on the door of apartment 4C at 11:47. The door opened in 7 seconds, the response time of someone who had been watching the corridor camera feed and had already decided, before Grace's knuckles connected with the wood, whether to let her in. The woman standing in the doorway was 47 years old and looked like someone who had spent 3 years in careful, sustained invisibility. Not aged by it, exactly, but concentrated, refined in the way that people are refined by sustained pressure. The non-essential parts of them gradually burned away until what remained was purely functional. She was wearing a plain gray sweater and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she had the hands of someone who had been working with documents for a very long time, fingers calloused at the tips in the specific way of a person who wrote by hand for hours each day, because handwriting left no digital signature. "Grace Carter," she said, not a question. She stepped back from the door. Grace entered. The apartment was extraordinary in its single-mindedness. Every surface, the kitchen table, the dining chairs, the floor in 3 separate areas, the walls of the second bedroom she could see through an open door, was covered in paper. Not scattered, organized, stacked and labeled and cross-referenced with a system that Grace could see, even from the doorway, was of considerable sophistication. Color-coded tabs, numbered folders. A wall in the second bedroom covered entirely in a hand-drawn chart, connecting names and dates and account numbers with lines of different colors and weights. The visual representation of a financial forensic reconstruction that had been built, Grace understood immediately. The way a surgeon builds something, with extreme precision and no wasted movement. "You're not Patricia Adami," Grace said. "No, The woman sat at the kitchen table and gestured at the chair across from her. "My name is Dr. Sophia Vane. I was the forensic accountant. Patricia Adami was a colleague who agreed, for reasons that cost her considerably, to allow her name to appear on certain documents during the period of my transition." "She's still alive?" She's in Portugal. She teaches accounting at a university there. She has a good life." Sophia folded her hands on the table. "I made sure of it. It was the least I owed her." Grace sat. She placed her father's badge on the table between them. Sophia looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not surprise, not sentiment, but the specific quality of a person encountering an object they have thought about many times in the abstract and are now confronting in its physical reality. "Daniel Carter found page 207, Sophia said. "In the preliminary version of this dossier that I had begun building before I understood how dangerous Ryan was, he was conducting a routine security audit of the financial division's document access logs. He found anomalies in the offshore transfer records and traced them back to the Heron Capital structure." She paused. "He came to me because we had worked together on a compliance review 18 months earlier, and he trusted my assessment. I told him what I suspected. I told him it needed to go directly to Ethan, and that it needed to go immediately, and that he should tell no one else." "He died the next morning," Grace said. "Yes." The word fell between them like a stone. "I understood then that Ryan had a surveillance capability inside the company that I had not accounted for," Sophia continued. "That the conversation Daniel and I had was monitored, that my own position was compromised. I had 6 days before Ryan moved against me. I used them." She gestured at the wall of paper. "I used them to build this, and then I disappeared into it." "You placed me in this house," Grace said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement that required confirmation. "Yes. You found the dialysis center. You put the flyer there." "I had been watching Ryan for 3 years, building the dossier, waiting for the right entry point. I needed someone inside the mansion who had the observational training to notice what needed noticing, the personal stake to keep going when it became dangerous, and the specific invisibility of someone Ryan would never assess as a threat." Sophia looked at her directly. "I needed someone who had already lost enough that the risk of losing more was not the deterrent it would be for someone with everything intact." Grace sat with this for a moment. "You used my mother's illness," she said. "I used the circumstances that already existed. I did not create them." A pause. "I'm aware that distinction matters more to me than it may to you." "It matters," Grace said. "I just haven't decided how much yet." Sophia nodded, accepting this. "I want to show you something," she said and stood. She led Grace into the second bedroom, the room with the wall chart and the stacked folders, and took from the top of a specific pile a document case that was heavier than it looked. She set it on the desk. 412 pages, she said. 6 years of Ryan's fraud. Every shell company, every offshore transfer, every identity used, every payment made to every person he compromised. The Heron Capital structure, the private clinic, the pharmaceutical supply chain, the 3 highway patrol reports, the retirement pensions. She opened the case and showed Grace the first page, a summary document, organized with the specific clarity of forensic accounting that has been prepared not just to be understood but to be prosecuted. 3 copies exist. 2 have been found and destroyed. This is the last one. Grace looked at the document case. She thought about her father sitting at their kitchen table, writing something he had not shown his family, carrying a weight he had protected them from. He was going to Ethan with page 207, she said. The morning after he died, he had an appointment. He called my burner phone the night before to confirm the meeting. Sophia's voice did not waver, but something in her eyes acknowledged what the words cost. He said he wanted to make sure he had it right before he took it to Mr. Hawthorne. He said he didn't want to bring something to a man like Ethan unless he was certain. Grace looked at the wall of paper, 3 years of one woman's hidden labor, built in an apartment that no one was supposed to find, for a case that no one was supposed to survive building. "How did you know I'd come?" she asked. Sophia almost smiled. "Because you're his daughter," she said, "and I knew Daniel Carter. He wouldn't have raised anyone who wouldn't." Martin Doyle had been a lawyer for 30 years and had filed documents in courts across 4 states, and he had never, in 30 years, walked into a courthouse and been told that a filing he had personally submitted the previous morning did not exist in the system. He stood at the intake counter on the 3rd floor of the circuit court building at 8:15 in the morning and watched the clerk, a young man named Davis who had the specific, apologetic manner of someone delivering news they do not fully understand, scroll through the filing registry for the 4th time with the same result. "I'm sorry, Mr. Doyle. There's nothing under your name for yesterday's date or this morning's." "I submitted the emergency injunction application at 8:47 yesterday morning," Martin said. His voice was level. He had been practicing this levelness since the car park. "I received a verbal acknowledgement from the intake officer and a handwritten receipt, which I have here." He placed the receipt on the counter. Davis examined it with the concentration of someone hopping. The document would resolve itself, if studied long enough. "The receipt number doesn't appear in our system," Davis said finally. "That's because the filing was removed from your system," Martin said, "between submission and official entry." Davis looked up. "Mr. Doyle, I don't think I can." "I'm not asking you to confirm it," Martin said. "I'm asking you to note that I was here and that I raised this discrepancy at 8:15 on this date. I'd like you to write that down." Davis wrote it down, with the handwriting of a man who understood he was creating a record someone very important did not want created. Martin thanked him and walked back to the car park with the measured pace of someone whose internal landscape was moving considerably faster than his exterior presentation. He had one backup. A physical copy of the injunction application and the accompanying testimony, locked in the fire-resistant safe in his private office. The same safe that had held the USB drive for 3 years, that he had trusted through every crisis, because it had never been compromised, because the combination existed only in his memory, because the safe's installation had predated the current building management by 12 years and appeared in no maintenance record that any subsequent building contractor would have access to. He called his assistant from the car park. "The safe," he said. "Don't open it, don't touch it. Just confirm it's locked and intact and call me back." She called back in 4 minutes. "It's locked," she said. "But Martin, someone from building maintenance was here this morning, between 7 and 7:30. They said there was a ventilation issue in your corridor." Martin stood very still in the car park. "Was there a ventilation issue?" A pause. I didn't check." "Thank you," he said. "Please go to lunch early today, off-site." He drove to his office in the specific, focused quiet of a man performing a calculation he already knows the answer to but needs to verify in order to act on it. He rode the elevator to his floor, walked the corridor, noted the absence of any ventilation maintenance signage, and entered his office. The safe was locked, exactly as his assistant had confirmed. He opened it. The injunction application was gone. In its place, on the velvet interior shelf where the documents had been stacked, sat a single playing card, face up. The Jack of Spades. Martin picked it up with 2 fingers and turned it over. Blank on the back, except for a small, handwritten H in the bottom right corner. He had seen this card before. Not recently, 5 years ago. He had seen it on Richard Hawthorne's desk, placed beneath a paperweight in the study, on the morning after Richard's death, and had assumed, without examining it closely, that it was simply a piece of household detritus, one of the hundreds of trivial objects that accumulate on the desks of busy men. He had not thought about it again until this moment, when the sight of it in his safe produced, with the force of a physical impact, the memory of Richard's desk and the memory of Ryan standing beside it, sorting through Richard's papers with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who was not grieving but cataloging, and who had at one point lifted the paperweight and pocketed what was beneath it before Martin could see it clearly. Martin sat down in his chair. The Jack of Spades. Ryan had been in Richard's study the morning after Richard's death. Ryan had taken the card from Richard's desk. Ryan had now placed it in Martin's safe, which meant the card was not a coincidence or a calling card chosen at random. It was communication, a private signal between Ryan and someone, about something that had been active for at least 5 years and that Richard had been aware of before he died. Martin turned the card over in his hands. He thought about what Grace's letter had said. "I believe you know why. I believe you want to do the right thing and haven't yet found a way to do it. I'm giving you a reason." He opened his desk drawer and removed a legal pad. He had lost the copy. The court filing was gone. His safe had been accessed by someone with knowledge and capability that suggested this was not the first time Ryan had managed a problem through this particular channel. Martin was a lawyer. He did not need the copy. He had the memory of every word he had written in it, because he was 61 years old and had spent 30 years developing the precise mental architecture that 30-year legal careers require. The ability to reconstruct a document from its component parts, argument by argument, fact by fact, with a fidelity that did not require the original paper. He began writing. He wrote for 3 hours and 40 minutes without stopping, without looking up, without answering his phone, reconstructing the testimony from the architecture of his own memory, adding to it the Jack of Spades, adding to it the memory of Richard's desk, adding to it the specific implications of a playing card that linked a dead man's study to a compromised safe 5 years later. When he finished, the document was longer than the original by 11 pages. He did not print it. He encrypted it and sent it to 6 different recipients simultaneously: 2 journalists, a federal investigator, a senior partner at a competing law firm who owed Martin a debt of professional honor, a judge in the federal circuit whose integrity Martin would have staked his license on, and 1 recipient whose contact information he had obtained that morning through a method he would not have considered legal 18 months ago and had stopped worrying about. Grace Carter's encrypted personal email. He sent it at 11:53. At 11:58, driving away from his office toward a federal building across the city, Martin's car was struck from behind by a black SUV that had been following him since he left the courthouse car park at 8:22. The impact drove his vehicle into the concrete barrier of a highway overpass. The SUV did not stop. His car crested the barrier and came to rest at an angle against the outer edge of the overpass, the passenger side suspended over open air. Martin sat in the wreckage with a broken left arm, a cut above his eye, and the specific, cold alertness of a man who understands that he has just survived something designed to be unsurvivable. He found his phone on the passenger floor. He called Grace. The call connected on the second ring. "Martin Doyle," he said, his voice was steady. "I have 40 seconds before someone comes. Listen to everything." He gave her 3 account numbers. The final 3 entries from the Heron Capital ledger that Ethan had stored in his memory. Numbers that Martin had received, through an encrypted channel, from one of Ethan's loyal board members the previous afternoon, completing the financial record that made the case airtight from every remaining angle. "There's one more thing," Martin said. "The Jack of Spades, tell Ethan, he'll know what it means." The line went dead. The window between the medication's morning dose and the arrival of full sedative effect lasted. On Sophia Vane's carefully reverse-engineered pharmacological assessment of the compound, approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes at the current dosage level. Ethan had been timing it for 3 weeks. Not the window itself. He had known its dimensions intuitively for months, had felt the daily rhythm of clarity and fog with the precision of a man who had no other landscape to navigate, and had therefore mapped this one with exceptional thoroughness. What he had been timing was Linda's routine. The specific minutes she spent in the room after each administration, the intervals between her corridor checks, the gap in the security rotation that occurred between 7:53 and 8:11 each morning, when the overnight guard completed his handover, and the day shift guard conducted his initial perimeter check of the ground floor before ascending. 18 minutes. He had 18 minutes. Grace had brought the device 3 days ago, a small encrypted recording and transmission unit that Sophia Vane had sourced through a channel Grace had not asked her to specify, small enough to conceal inside the spine of one of the decorative books on Ethan's bedside shelf. The books that nobody in the mansion had ever opened because they were there for atmosphere rather than reading, and had therefore never been examined by Crane's monthly sweep of the room's contents. Ethan had identified 3 board members he still trusted. He had based this assessment not on sentiment but on evidence, on 3 years of observing the board's behavior through the filter of documents Ryan brought to him for signing, through the specific quality of the signatures Ryan most urgently required, through the pattern of which board members' names appeared most frequently on the authorizations that concentrated power in Ryan's direction. The members Ryan needed most enthusiastically were the ones Ryan trusted least to act independently. The ones whose names appeared rarely, whose authorizations Ryan worked around rather than through, were the ones who had been successfully sidelined rather than co-opted. 3 names: Harrison, Ewan, Okafor. He had memorized their encrypted contact protocols from documents he had been shown briefly during a board communication review 18 months ago. Shown because Ryan believed he was too medicated to retain them, and had been wrong about that, as he had been wrong about most things related to the quality of Ethan's mind. At 7:55, Linda administered the morning injection. What entered Ethan's arm was saline. He did not react to this. He had suspected since the previous morning that something had changed in the injection's composition. His clarity on the morning following Grace's repositioning of the medication had been fuller and earlier than the previous day's window had suggested, and the hypothesis that Linda had altered the compound fit the behavioral evidence he had been accumulating about her state of mind since Grace's reassignment. He trusted the hypothesis sufficiently to act on it. At 7:58, Linda left the room. At 8:01, Ethan retrieved the device from the book spine, activated it with a button press that required fine motor control in his right hand. Fine motor control that the medication had been suppressing, and that had been cautiously, incrementally returning as the compound left his system, and began speaking. He spoke for 11 minutes and 14 seconds. He spoke clearly, without notes, because the notes were inside his mind, and had been organized there with the same precision he had once organized financial presentations. Structured for maximum comprehension, minimum ambiguity, and the specific persuasive clarity of a man who had built a company from nothing, and understood exactly what it took to make people believe something they weren't yet certain of. He named Ryan. He named the compound and the clinic. He named the offshore accounts under Heron Capital and provided the first 3 account numbers from his internal ledger, keeping the final 3 in reserve, understanding that a complete financial record delivered all at once was less strategically valuable than a partial record delivered to establish credibility, with the completion held as leverage. He described the document signing sessions he could reconstruct from memory, dates, document descriptions, specific language he had retained despite the medication's attempt to prevent retention. He named Penfield, the judge, because he had heard Ryan say the name through the building's secure line vibration 4 years ago and had never found a context that made it benign. And at the end of 11 minutes and 14 seconds, he said something he had not planned to say, but that arrived with the unstoppable quality of a truth that has been held too long in the wrong place. Father built this company before I did. He built it out of nothing the same way I did, and he gave it to me not because I was his son, but because he believed I was the right person to carry it. I have spent 3 years in this chair watching someone dismantle what 2 generations of this family built, and I want to be clear about something. This is not about money, and it is not about the company. This is about the people who died. Daniel Carter, Marcus Webb, the 2 accidents before mine. And my father, whose heart failure I am now prepared to state, on this recording, in front of whatever authority receives it, I do not believe was natural. Find the Jack of Spades. Ask Martin Doyle what it was doing on my father's desk. He stopped the recording at 8:12. He transmitted it to Harrison, Ewan, and Akafer through the encrypted channel at 8:13. At 8:14, the day security guard's footsteps sounded in the corridor. Ethan replaced the device in the book spine, composed his face into its habitual blankness, and placed his hands in their habitual position on the wheelchair arms. Linda returned at 8:20 for the secondary vital check. She looked at him for a moment before beginning the check. "You look different this morning," she said quietly. Not an accusation, an observation delivered in the careful, neutral register of a woman choosing her words with precision. "Do I?" Ethan said. She met his eyes. "More yourself," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for this morning." She understood what he meant. Her face did not change, but something behind it shifted, the specific quality of a person who has finally, after a long time carrying something alone, felt the weight of it acknowledged. She completed the vital check without another word and left the room. On his monitor, in his private study, Ryan reviewed the board communications intercept log that Crane ran each morning, a surveillance layer that monitored outgoing digital transmissions from known devices in the mansion's network. The encryption on the transmission at 8:13 was one he did not recognize, which meant it had not been sent from any device his surveillance covered, which meant there was a device in this house that Ryan did not know about. He sat very still for a moment. Then he called Crane. "Search his room," he said. "Everything, books, bedding, the chair itself, everything." "What am I looking for?" "Something that shouldn't be there," Ryan said, "and find it before the board does." Noah Carter was 10 years old and had his father's eyes and his sister's stubbornness, and the combination of these 2 inherited qualities had produced, in a child whose adult life was still entirely theoretical, a person who was exceptionally difficult to redirect once he had decided on a course of action. He had decided, on the morning of the 3rd day that Grace came home without eating dinner and went to bed without sleeping, that he needed to see where she worked. Not because he doubted the hotel story. Noah was 10, not oblivious, and he had understood for at least a year that the building in his drawing, the towers and fountains and chandeliers that he had rendered in crayon at age 9, with the ambitious inaccuracy of a child trying to match an imagined scale, was not quite the place his sister actually went every morning. He had understood it the way children understand the protective fictions adults maintain, not by seeing through them exactly, but by developing, through prolonged exposure to a person's tension and their careful management of what they say versus what their face says, an intuition about the distance between the 2. Grace was scared. Noah was not going to stay home while his sister was scared. He had left before Emily woke, carrying his school backpack containing his lunch and his library book, and the small, precise drawing he had done the previous night of a very large house on a very high hill, and had taken the bus that Grace took every morning because he had memorized the route the way children, memorize the things that connect them to the people they love. He had made it to the staff entrance of Hawthorne Mansion at 7:42. He had made it through the service corridor to the second floor landing at 8:05, guided by a lucky combination of the shift change chaos and a service lift that the overnight staff had left propped open. He had made it approximately 12 feet down the second floor corridor before he encountered Ryan Hawthorne. Ryan had been conducting what Crane called a walkthrough, an informal survey of the household that Ryan performed irregularly and without announcement, a habit left over from the early period after the accident when he had been establishing his authority over the staff and had learned that unpredictable appearances produced a quality of alertness in employees that scheduled inspections did not. He rounded the corridor corner and found a small boy standing in the hallway outside Ethan's door, backpack on, looking at the mahogany double doors with an expression of concentrated assessment. Ryan stopped. He looked at the child for 3 full seconds. Then he crouched down, which was something he did with a practiced naturalness that was genuinely impressive. The physical grammar of an adult who understands that the fastest way to establish non-threat to a child is to get to their eye level, and smiled his most pleasant smile. "Hello," he said, "you look a bit lost." Noah looked at him carefully. Noah had his father's eyes, which meant he also had his father's instinct, the instinct of a man who had spent a career in corporate security learning to read the distance between a person's face and their intention. It manifested in Noah as a quality of stillness when confronted with something that didn't quite fit, a pause before response, a slight narrowing of assessment. "I'm looking for my sister," Noah said. "And who's your sister?" "Grace, she works here." Ryan's pleasant expression did not change. Nothing in his face moved at all, which was, if Noah had had the vocabulary for it, precisely the tell. The absence of the micro-reactions that genuine surprise produces in a person who hasn't been expecting a piece of information. "Grace is your sister," Ryan said. "She's a wonderful member of our team. She's working in the laundry wing today, that's downstairs. Let me have someone take you to her." He straightened and called, without raising his voice, for the household assistant who was never more than 15 feet from him during walkthrough. A car was arranged within 4 minutes. The driver was Crane. Noah sat in the back of the black car while Crane drove without speaking, and Noah, who had learned from years of listening to adults talk freely in his presence, because adults consistently underestimated the attention of quiet children, looked out the window and pretended to sleep. Crane's phone rang at 8:23. "He's with me," Crane said. "Yes, the sister's brother." A pause. "Understood. I'll handle the conversation with the girl when she gets home. Standard approach, make it clear the house isn't a good place for family visits." Another pause, and then something that made Noah's body go very still under his pretended sleep. "The lawyer's been dealt with. Forsyth is clean. The filing doesn't exist. What we need now is 24 hours and the signature." A pause. "Yes, the girl's the variable. I'll make that clear to her tonight." Crane ended the call. Noah breathed very carefully and did not move and looked at the back of Crane's head and memorized, with the focused precision of his father's eyes and his sister's instinct for the detail that matters most, the face he could see reflected in the front mirror. The face of a man receiving instructions about his sister, about a lawyer who had been dealt with, about a signature that someone needed. He drew it in his library book margin when Crane stopped at a red light. The small, precise drawing of a man whose reflected face in a car mirror contained something Noah recognized from the animals in his nature documentaries. The specific, flat quality of something that had decided what it was going to do before the decision was required. He drew it carefully. He would show it to Grace tonight. Grace, watching the security footage in the laundry wing supervisor's office, footage she had requested access to on the pretext of confirming that Noah had safely departed the premises, saw Ryan crouch to her brother's eye level and smile. She had seen Ryan smile many times. This smile was different only in the specific object of its direction. Her brother. The cold that moved through her chest was not fear. It had moved past fear 2 days ago, in the moment she read her father's badge and understood that this house had already taken one member of her family. It was something colder than fear. It was the specific resolve of someone who has understood, completely and without remaining ambiguity, that what is happening around them is no longer something they can afford to simply navigate. It must be ended. The deep cleaning of Ryan's private study was scheduled twice yearly, in accordance with the household maintenance calendar that Margaret Collins maintained with the precision of a military logistics officer and the authority of someone who had been doing it for 2 decades and had outlasted 3 generations of Hawthorne management. The scheduling was Margaret's. The access was mandatory. No room in the mansion was exempt from the biannual deep clean, and Ryan had learned, when he attempted to exempt his study in the first year of his occupancy, that Margaret's response to that particular request was a silence so comprehensive and so specifically weighted that he had rescinded the exemption rather than endure its continuation. Grace was assigned to the study because the laundry wing supervisor had developed a migraine at 9:45 and Margaret, redistributing the morning's tasks with characteristic efficiency, had placed Grace on the study rotation without sentiment or particular significance. Ryan was not in the house. He had left at 9:15 for a meeting at the corporate headquarters. A meeting Grace would later learn was a preemptive appearance at the board offices designed to establish his visible, calm authority before Harrison, Ewan, and Acaffer received whatever they had been sent. Grace entered the study at 10:20. She had not planned to look for anything specific. She had been a nursing student, not a detective, and the habits of her particular intelligence were not the dramatic, targeted habits of someone conducting a search. They were the quiet, continuous habits of someone who noticed things, who moved through a space and registered its details the way a clinician registers a patient's room, not hunting for anything in particular but alert to everything that sat slightly wrong. The study was exactly what Ryan's study should have been: expensive, organized, understated in the specific way of a man who wanted to project competence rather than opulence. Bookshelves with serious volumes in good condition. A desk that cost more than a car and wore its cost quietly. Framed certificates and accolades arranged on one wall with the careful composition of a man who understood that the display of achievement required calibration, enough to establish authority, not so much as to appear insecure. She dusted the certificates and the frames methodically. The frame at the far end of the row, a professional commendation from a technology industry body, 5 years old, sat 4 millimeters further from the wall than the others. It was a detail so small that it was invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 2 years developing the habit of noticing what was exactly where it was supposed to be versus what was almost where it was supposed to be. Grace touched the frame. It swung outward on a small hinge, not secured to the wall at the back but hinged at the top, a concealment mechanism as old as the technology of concealment itself. Behind it, attached to the wall with a single piece of adhesive, was a photograph. Not printed on photo paper, printed on regular paper, which meant it had been printed privately, without going through any external service. The image was slightly lower resolution than professional printing, but entirely clear. 2 people standing at what appeared to be a private airfield, a small jet visible in the background, both of them caught in the specific, unguarded quality of people who did not know they were being photographed. Ryan in shirt sleeves, his jacket over one arm. A woman beside him, slightly turned toward the camera, laughing at something outside the frame. The woman was in her mid-50s, with the kind of groomed, deliberate appearance of someone who operated professionally in environments where presentation was a tool. She wore a lanyard around her neck that was turned slightly away from the camera, but not entirely. Grace looked at the partial text visible on the lanyard badge for a long moment. She photographed the photograph with her phone, zooming to the lanyard, then left the frame exactly as she had found it, 4 millimeters from the wall, certificate facing outward, and completed the study cleaning with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She sent the photograph to Sophia Vane at 11:03. Sophia's response arrived in 4 minutes. Dr. Camille Rowe, founder and CEO, Arcturus Biosciences, private clinic subsidiary, the one on the requisition form. She and Ryan have been in a pharmaceutical distribution partnership for 4 years, predating the compound being administered to Ethan by 8 months. She's been supplying him not just with the drug but with the clinical cover, the fake medical infrastructure that makes it look, to any external review, like legitimate private care. The date on the back of the photograph. Grace turned the image on her phone to the back of the original. She had photographed both sides. The date was 6 days before Ethan's accident. And in handwriting that was not Ryan's, smaller, rounder, the handwriting of someone who had written it quickly and without thinking about its significance, 2 words. Until forever. Grace stared at the words. They were not the words of a business partner. She sent the image back to Sophia with a single question. Were they together? Sophia's response took longer this time, 8 minutes. I didn't know, but it explains the construction of the pharmaceutical supply chain. The clinic was never just a financial arrangement. She built it for him. She built the entire medical cover because she believed in what he was doing, or believed in him, which may be the same thing. It also means she's more exposed than I calculated. A business partner can claim distance. Someone who built the infrastructure out of personal devotion cannot. This changes things, Grace. She's not just a co-conspirator. She's a liability Ryan is running out of road with. And when people become liabilities to Ryan Hawthorne. The message ended there. Grace looked at the unfinished sentence on her phone screen and understood what Sophia had not written. She thought about the woman in the photograph, laughing at an airfield, unaware of the camera, wearing someone's lanyard. She thought about what it cost to build something for someone you loved, and then discover what you had actually built it for. She put her phone in her pocket and finished cleaning the study. She did not replace the frame 4 millimeters from the wall. She placed it flush against it. A small thing. A message, if Ryan looked carefully enough, that someone had been here. She wanted him to know. The body is a more faithful record keeper than memory. Ethan Hawthorne had understood this abstractly for most of his adult life, had understood it in the way that educated people understand things they have read and processed, but not yet experienced with their own physical architecture. He had read, in the early months of his paralysis, everything accessible to him about neurological trauma and pharmaceutical effects on motor function, had constructed from the available literature a theoretical model of what was happening inside him and why. The theoretical model had been, in its broad strokes, accurate. It had been insufficient. The accuracy of what the compound had been doing to him, not just to his cognition, but to his physical function, had required 3 weeks of that compound's absence from his system to become truly, viscerally clear. Linda had been substituting saline for 14 days. The first 3 days had produced only a subtle shift in the daily clarity window. It lasted longer, started earlier, and had a cleaner edge to it, like the difference between a room with 1 window and a room with 4. His mind had been working on this problem for a long time, and the removal of the chemical interference that had been slowing its mechanisms produced the specific, gathering quality of a system returning to its operational baseline. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the quiet, accumulating momentum of something that has been constrained and is now, incrementally, being released. By day 7, He had noticed that his right hand was responding to intentional direction in ways it had not responded to in 3 years. Not significantly. A tremor first, the disorganized, exploratory tremor of neural pathways that had been suppressed long enough to have partially forgotten their roots and were now attempting to relearn them. Then, by day 9, something more organized. A controlled curl of 3 fingers around the wheelchair arm in response to a specific, focused intention. Slow, effortful. The effort of a man trying to lift something with a muscle that has been atrophied, not severed. He did not tell anyone. He had developed over 3 years an extraordinary capacity for behavioral concealment, the specific skill of a person who has learned that their only safe privacy is the privacy of an internal landscape that no external expression betrays. Every morning when Linda arrived, he was exactly as she had left him. Hands still, face composed, the vacancy intact. On the morning of day 15, in the pre-dawn dark at 4:22, Ethan Hawthorne gripped both arms of his wheelchair. He pushed. It was not a smooth or graceful movement. It was not the movement of a man reclaiming his body in a cinematic, triumphant arc. It was a slow, shaking, technically imperfect achievement that cost him everything he had, every gram of the recovered neural function, every ounce of the physical reserves that the compound's absence had been slowly rebuilding, every piece of the focused, absolute intention that 3 years of thinking about this moment had accumulated. He stood. For 11 seconds, Ethan Hawthorne stood on his own feet. His legs shook from the first second. His grip on the wheelchair arms was the only reason he did not fall immediately. His vision narrowed at the edges, the specific narrowing of a circulatory system, managing an unfamiliar demand. And his breath came in controlled, deliberate pulls that he managed with the focus of someone who understood that everything in the next 11 seconds depended on not losing control of the one system that was performing exactly as required. He did not smile. He did not feel triumph. He had expected, in the version of this moment he had constructed in his imagination over 3 years, that standing would produce something dramatic and complete. It produced instead something quieter and more devastating, the simple, undeniable confirmation that he was still there. That the person who had built something from nothing, who had loved his father, who had trusted his cousin, who had been reduced to a man in a chair that other people pushed, that person still occupied this body, still had access to it, still could, with time and with the continued absence of the compound, reclaim it. Ryan had not taken everything. He had taken 3 years. He would not take the 4th. Ethan lowered himself back into the chair after the 11th second, his arms shaking with the effort of the controlled descent. He sat in the dark and breathed and let the shakiness pass through him without resistance. He did not know about the camera. Ryan had installed it independently of the mansion's primary security system 14 months ago, when he had first begun to notice the quality of Ethan's blinks. The double blink during document signings that Ethan deployed with the precision of a man communicating in a code he had not yet found the audience for. The camera fed directly to Ryan's phone, on a private app that displayed a thumbnail whenever motion was detected in the room. It was not part of the security dashboard Crane monitored. It was Ryan's private eye, installed for the specific purpose of monitoring the person Ryan most needed to believe he had under complete control. Ryan's phone buzzed at 4:23. He was awake. He was always awake at 4:23, because 4:23 was when the compound's management calculations were most present in his mind, was when he reviewed the day's schedule and the document timeline and the board communication intercepts. He looked at the thumbnail. He watched the 11-second clip twice. He set the phone face down on his desk. And Ryan Hawthorne, for the first time in 5 years of constructing and executing and defending a plan that he had believed, was comprehensive enough to account for every possible variable. Sat in the dark of his study and felt something arrive in his chest that he had not allowed himself to feel since he was 14 years old, and had found his mother collapsed in her room, and had stood in the doorway understanding, with the precocious, cold clarity that would define every major decision of the following 22 years, that the world did not rebalance itself on your behalf, and that if you wanted something to survive, you had to be willing to do what softer people would not. Fear. Real fear. The kind that arrives not as panic but as clarity, the specific, cold, highly functional clarity of a person who has just understood that the thing they most needed to prevent has already begun. Ethan was standing, which meant Ethan was returning, which meant Ryan had less time than he had calculated, and the calculation he had been running for 3 years, the elegant, airtight calculation of a man who had thought of everything, had been based on a premise that was no longer true. He picked up his phone. He did not call Crane. He opened the contacts list and scrolled to a number he had not dialed in 8 months, a number attached to a name he would never have admitted, in any professional context, to possessing. The call connected on the 4th ring. "It's accelerating," Ryan said. "I need a contingency." The voice on the other end, female, controlled, and carrying beneath its control the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for this call with a mixture of dread and relief, said, "How much time do we have?" 24 hours, Ryan said, "maybe less." A long pause. "Ryan," Dr. Camille Rowe said slowly, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 3 days ago." Grace read through the night. She had arranged the dossier's 412 pages on every available surface in her bedroom: the desk, the floor, the bed, the top of the box that contained her nursing textbooks, and moved through them in the order Sophia had organized them, which was not chronological but structural, beginning with the architecture of the fraud and moving outward to its human cost, the way a forensic accountant builds a case not from the perimeter inward but from the center outward, establishing the mechanism before establishing the damage. The mechanism was elegant in the specific, cold way that frauds of this scale are always elegant, because they are built by intelligent people, and intelligence applied to deception produces something that is genuinely impressive before it produces anything else. Ryan had constructed Heron Capital using his mother's maiden name, Elaine Heron, dead 20 years, her identity preserved in precisely the administrative documents needed to establish corporate personhood, and entirely absent from any living database that could flag the anomaly. The offshore account structure beneath Heron Capital ran through 4 jurisdictions chosen for the specific combination of financial privacy and legal complexity that made tracing difficult without international cooperation, and the transfers themselves were timed to coincide with legitimate company transactions large enough to provide cover in the overall financial reporting. $2 billion over 6 years. Not taken in large, visible movements, taken in the way water takes the shape of what contains it, continuously, quietly, in amounts calibrated to remain below the threshold of the internal audit triggers that Ethan had built into the company's compliance architecture. Ryan had known those thresholds because Ethan had trusted him with them. Grace wrote in the margins as she read, not analysis, just markers, the way she had marked her nursing textbooks, flagging the points that would need to be returned to, the connections that needed to be followed. She was 3/4 of the way through the dossier when she turned to page 207. She had been told about this page. Seeing it was different from being told about it. It was a single page from an internal financial access log, the document her father had found during his security audit, the page that had brought him to Sophia, the page he had been bringing to Ethan on the morning of the day he died. It showed a sequence of access events, a series of financial files accessed from a terminal registered to the Heron Capital administrative account, at times that placed the access outside standard business hours, by a user whose session credentials had been generated through an internal IT process that had since been quietly deleted from the system's administrative log. In the margin of the page, in Sophia's handwriting, D. Carter found this first. He was going to Ethan with it the morning after he died. Grace put the page down. She picked it up again. She read those 2 sentences 4 more times, with the specific, returned attention of a person who needs to let something fully land before they can continue. Her father had found this page, had understood what it meant, had made an appointment, had called Sophia the night before to confirm, and had died before the morning came. She turned to page 208. On this page, which was a transaction authorization record, she found 2 signatures she recognized. The first was Ryan Hawthorne's, expected. The second was Martin Doyle's. She sat very still. Martin's signature appeared as an attestation, a legal witness mark confirming that the signatories had been present and that the transaction had been explained to them. It was the kind of signature that a family attorney would place on dozens of documents without examining each one in forensic detail, trusting the summary provided by the person presenting the document. And the person presenting the document had been Ryan. Martin had not known what he was witnessing, but his signature made him appear, to any authority that reviewed the document without the context Sophia had built, as a participant. Ryan had used Martin's professional integrity as a shield. Grace understood now the specific nature of the weight Martin had been carrying, not just the weight of the USB drive and the accident footage and the 3 years of silence, but the weight of a man who had looked at his own signature on a document he had not read carefully enough and understood, too late, that he had been made to appear complicit in something he had not known existed. She kept reading. At page 341, she found the pharmaceutical supply chain documentation, the records connecting Arcturus Biosciences to the private clinic, to the compound being administered to Ethan. Dr. Camille Rowe's name appeared 12 times in these pages. Not as a reluctant participant or an arm's-length supplier, but as a co-architect, someone who had designed the clinical cover with professional precision, who had created the documentation structure that made the compound's administration appear, to any external medical review, like legitimate specialized care. At page 376, she found something Sophia had not mentioned. A payment record. A single payment, routed through a Heron Capital subsidiary, to an account registered to a corporate entity called Forsyth Consulting LLC. Dale Forsyth, the highway patrol sergeant who had investigated all 3 accident scenes and had retired on a pension, 3 times the government standard. Sophia had documented his payment, which meant Sophia had known, for 3 years, that the investigating officer was compromised, which meant the case Sophia was building was not just a financial fraud case. It was a murder case. 3 murders and 1 attempted murder, documented with the specific, patient precision of a forensic accountant who had understood, from the moment she decided to disappear rather than die, that she was not building something to be used quickly. She was building something to be used completely. Grace closed the dossier at 4:17 in the morning. She sat in the silence of her bedroom, the nursing textbooks under the desk, her father's badge on the windowsill, Noah's crayon hotel on the wall above the door where she had pinned it 2 years ago because it made her smile every time she left for work, and she made a decision. Not a frightened decision. Not a decision made in the adrenaline of immediate threat or the grief of immediate loss. A cold, complete, fully informed decision. She was going to finish what her father started. All of it. Every page of it. For him and for the 2 other people who had found the same truth and had not survived finding it. She picked up her phone and called Sophia. "I've read it," she said when Sophia answered. "All of it. All of it." A pause. "Then you know what we need to do next," Sophia said. "Yes," Grace said, "and I know how." Ryan Hawthorne called Grace to his study at 2 in the afternoon. The summons came through Margaret Collins, who delivered it with the expression of someone who had been given an instruction that sat slightly wrong with her professional instincts and had decided, for reasons she did not articulate, to deliver it with unusual formality, as though the formality itself was a kind of preparation. "Mr. Hawthorne would like to see you in his study, now." Grace changed out of her cleaning uniform and walked through the mansion's primary corridor in the clothes she had arrived in: dark trousers, a plain white shirt, the worn shoes that had been resoled twice, and did not allow herself to feel the weight of the building around her. She had grown up understanding that spaces built to intimidate were effective only if you allowed yourself to be measured against them, and she had spent enough of her life in spaces that were not built for people like her to have developed a practiced immunity to the particular form of diminishment that wealth deployed through architecture. Ryan was behind his desk when she entered. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had been cut to his specific measurements by a tailor who charged more for a fitting than Grace earned in a month. His desk was clear of everything except a single folder and 2 water glasses. The afternoon light through the window behind him was arranged with the unconscious perfection of a man who had always lived in spaces where the light did what he needed it to do. He gestured at the chair across from the desk. She sat. He studied her for a moment with the practiced assessment of a man who read people the way other people read market reports, not for connection, but for variables. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said, "because I think you're someone who prefers directness, and because I believe we've arrived at a point where the indirect approach is less efficient than the situation requires." "I appreciate directness," Grace said. "Good." He opened the folder. "I want to offer you something. A genuine offer, not a threat, not a warning. A transaction between 2 people who both understand that the current situation has costs for both of them." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. Grace looked at it. $2 million. Her mother's medical bills paid in full in perpetuity through a trust established for Emily Carter's ongoing care. A college fund for Noah, fully funded through postgraduate level. A nursing school placement, full scholarship, at the best institution in the country, beginning the following academic year. In exchange, Grace left the mansion today, returned or destroyed any copies she had made of any documents she had encountered during her employment, signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement covering all aspects of her employment and any matters related to the Hawthorne family, and had no further contact with Ethan Hawthorne. She read it to the end. She placed it back on the desk. She looked at Ryan. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "The watch in your desk drawer," she said. "The cracked one. Where did you get it?" The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Grace watched Ryan Hawthorne's face with the clinical attention of a former nursing student observing a patient's vital response. And what she observed was not the specific tells of guilt, not the obvious physical signals of a man caught. It was something more fundamental and more revealing. Complete stillness. The specific, total stillness of a person whose body has suspended all non-essential function in order to manage the information that has just been delivered to it. The stillness of someone who has been calculating, for weeks and months and years, which of the things they are holding could never be explained away, and has just heard the name of that thing spoken aloud by the last person they expected to speak it. Ryan recovered in 3 seconds. His face recomposed itself with impressive speed. The muscles of a man who had been performing composure his entire life returning to their trained positions without apparent effort. But Grace had seen the 3 seconds. And Ryan knew she had. "The watch," he said, in a voice that was almost entirely his usual voice, "is a personal item with significant sentimental value." "Whose sentiment?" Grace asked. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. "The offer on the table," he said, "is the most generous version of this conversation. I want you to understand that clearly." "I understand it clearly," Grace said. She stood, straightening her plain white shirt. "I need 24 hours to think about it." She was not going to accept the offer. Ryan knew she was not going to accept the offer. They both understood in the silence that followed her standing that the request for 24 hours was not deliberation, it was logistics. She needed 24 hours for something, and the thing she needed it for was not the decision itself. 24 hours, Ryan said. Grace walked to the door. "Miss Carter," Ryan said. She turned. His pleasant smile was intact, but his eyes, which she had been watching for weeks, held the specific quality she had first identified in the corridor outside Ethan's room and had been tracking since, the quality of eyes that had made a decision several sentences before the conversation ended. "Enjoy the evening with your family," he said. It was not a pleasantry. Grace walked out of the study and down the corridor, and out through the staff entrance and sat in the early evening air for 40 seconds, breathing slowly and deliberately, before she picked up her phone. She called Sophia first. "He has the watch," she said, "and he knows that I know." "How long do we have?" Grace thought about Ryan's eyes. "Less than we planned for," she said. "We move tonight." Harrison, Ewan, and Akafor received Ethan's encrypted message at 8:13 in the morning. They were three people who had arrived at their positions on the Hawthorne Technologies board through different routes. Harrison, through 30 years in enterprise software. Ewan through a venture capital career that had funded 12 of the most significant technology companies of the previous decade. Akafor through a legal and governance background that had made her the board's most technically rigorous member on matters of fiduciary duty. But who had reached? Independently and through the accumulated experience of watching Ryan Hawthorne manage the company's affairs for 3 years, the same quiet, unspoken conclusion that something was wrong, that they could not yet say specifically what, and that the right moment to address it had not yet arrived. The encrypted message was the moment. Harrison called Ewan at 8:19. "Have you listened to it?" "3 times, Ewan said. "All of it?" "The account numbers check," Ewan said quietly. "The first 3. I ran them against the offshore registry. They're real, they're active, and they're registered to an entity called Heron Capital that does not appear in any of the company's disclosed financial statements." A pause. "I'm calling Akafor," Harrison said. By 9:15, all 3 had agreed on an emergency private session. Off schedule, off the official meeting protocol, conducted in Ewan's personal offices rather than the company's boardroom, which they had each, independently, decided to assume was surveilled. 4 other board members were contacted and attended. 7 of 11. Sufficient for an emergency resolution. The session began at 11. Ryan's 4 co-opted board members, people whose support he had cultivated through a combination of financial incentive and strategic information management, arrived at 11:02, and the member who had been Ryan's most reliable informant, a man named Prescott who had been providing Ryan with advance notice of board sentiment for 2 years, immediately moved to table the session on procedural grounds. He cited quorum requirements. He cited the lack of official notice. He cited the absence of legal counsel. He was mid-sentence on the 3rd citation when Akafor's tablet displayed a notification. A secure digital delivery. From a public library terminal, time-stamped 11:04. 20 pages of documentation, formatted with the specific precision of forensic accounting prepared for legal prosecution, beginning with a cover page that identified the document as an excerpt from a complete financial audit of Hawthorne Technologies' offshore account structure for the period covering the past 6 years. Akafor read the first page in silence. She passed the tablet to Harrison. Harrison read 2 pages and passed it to Ewan. Prescott was still speaking. Nobody was listening to Prescott. "This is inadmissible," Prescott said. "It's an anonymous document from an unverified source, and it has no standing in." "It has standing before this board," Hawthorne said, in a voice that had the specific, quiet quality of someone who has spent her career not needing to raise it. "Because this board has fiduciary responsibility to investigate material financial concerns regardless of their source, and what is described in these 20 pages constitutes a material financial concern of the first order." She looked at Prescott directly. "Sit down," she said. Prescott sat down. The session lasted 4 hours. At its conclusion, by a vote of 6-1, Prescott dissenting, which was itself a piece of information the other 6 noted carefully, the board passed an emergency resolution requesting a forensic audit of all company financial records for the past 6 years, freezing all pending asset transfers pending the audit's completion, and suspending the executive chairman's unilateral signing authority pending an independent review of Ethan Hawthorne's cognitive capacity. Hawthorne drafted the resolution herself. She filed it with the company's independent legal counsel at 3:15. She then reached into her briefcase and produced a sealed letter, the one she had received through an encrypted channel from Ethan's recorded message, which had contained not just the 3 account numbers but a second file she had not disclosed to the group until the resolution was passed. The second file was a letter, handwritten by Ethan 3 years ago and sealed before his accident, addressed T.